The term Goyim serves as a central identifier in Jewish discourse for non-Jews, carrying layers of degradation and exclusion that underscore a persistent theme of superiority within Jewish texts and cultural practices. Originating in Hebrew as a descriptor for nations, the word evolves into a marker of otherness that positions non-Jews, particularly those of European descent, as inferior entities subject to exploitation or conquest. This usage reflects a historical pattern where Jewish identity is defined against the backdrop of Gentile inadequacy, with Goyim embodying notions of moral, intellectual, and spiritual deficiency. In contexts ranging from ancient scriptures to modern sermons, the term facilitates portrayals of non-Jews as tools for Jewish benefit, devoid of inherent value beyond servitude. Such depictions reinforce a binary worldview where Jews occupy a privileged status, while Goyim are relegated to subservient roles, often likened to animals or dismissed as irrelevant in divine schemes. This degrading application of Goyim extends into cultural slang and public statements, where it functions as a slur to demean non-Jews, especially white Europeans, by associating them with stereotypes of crudeness and unworthiness. Historical grievances, such as the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, amplify this rhetoric, equating modern white Western societies with ancient enemies like Rome or Edom, thereby justifying calls for their defeat or subjugation. The term's persistence in private conversations and religious teachings highlights its role in maintaining internal boundaries, where non-Jews are secretly discussed in terms that affirm Jewish dominance. Through media, literature, and political discourse, Goyim conveys contempt, portraying white people as exploitable or conquerable, rooted in a tradition that views them as perpetual outsiders. The implications of Goyim as a term of degradation reveal a cultural norm where non-Jews are systematically othered, with white Europeans bearing the brunt in contemporary settings due to demographic and historical alignments. This usage, drawn from holy texts and extended into everyday language, establishes a framework of superiority that degrades Gentiles by excluding them from full human or spiritual equivalence. In sermons and writings, religious leaders employ Goyim to advocate for conquest, framing white Western nations as successors to Roman oppressors deserving of retribution. The term's offensive nature is evident in its avoidance in mixed company, signaling an intent to convey insult privately while preserving group exclusivity. Origins and biblical usage. The Hebrew Bible employs the term Goyim repeatedly to designate nations, frequently casting non-Jewish collectives in roles of opposition, insignificance, or moral deficiency. In Psalms 2 verse 1, the text asks why the Goyim rage and plot against the Lord and his anointed, framing them as rebellious forces whose schemes are futile and destined for divine overthrow. This portrayal positions Goyim as active adversaries to the divine order, emphasizing their inevitable subjugation. Similarly, Isaiah 40 verse 15 reduces the Goyim to a mere drop in a bucket or dust on a scale, stripping them of any substantial weight in the presence of God's power. Such imagery establishes Goyim not merely as foreign peoples, but as entities of negligible value, inherently subordinate to the covenant community. Additional passages deepen this pattern of diminishment. Psalms 9 verse 17 consigns the wicked Goyim who forget God to Sheol, implying an intrinsic moral corruption that leads to eternal judgment. Isaiah 40 verse 17 goes further, asserting that all Goyim amount to nothing before God, counted as less than vanity and emptiness. These declarations shift the term from a simple geographical or ethnic label to one laden with condemnation, where Goyim represent chaos, idolatry, or oblivion. Non-Jewish nations appear as obstacles in the path of divine purpose, requiring defeat or dismissal to affirm the centrality of Israel. This scriptural foundation shapes the term's enduring trajectory in Jewish thought. By consistently associating Goyim with rebellion, worthlessness, and exclusion from covenantal privilege, the biblical texts create a template for later discourse that views non-Jews as spiritually and morally deficient. The application extends beyond ancient Near Eastern peoples to encompass any non-Israelite group, including those of European descent in subsequent historical contexts. This pattern solidifies Goyim as a marker of inferiority, reinforcing a worldview in which Jewish identity stands in elevated contrast to Gentile collectives deemed foolish, unworthy, or destined for judgment. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. Rabbinic literature transforms the biblical term Goyim into explicit statements of non-Jewish subordination and exclusion. In Sanhedrin 59a, a Goy who studies Torah incurs the death penalty, as the sacred law belongs exclusively to Israel as an inheritance. This ruling reserves divine wisdom for Jews alone, casting Goyim as unauthorized intruders unworthy of access. Yevamot 61a derives from Ezekiel 34 verse 31 that only Jews are termed men, Adam, in the context of ritual impurity, concluding that graves of Goyim do not convey 10 impurity because Goyim fall outside this category of humanity. Avodah Zarah 3a ridicules Goyim as fools of the world who demand the Torah anew after rejecting it, and depicts them futilely attempting to fulfill the Sukkah commandment only to abandon it in failure, symbolizing their inherent incapacity for divine service. Mystical traditions amplify this hierarchy with metaphysical claims. Zohar 147 AM assigns Goyim to the dominion of 70 angelic princes and impure forces, while Israel remains under God's direct sovereignty, creating an unbridgeable separation rooted in cosmic impurity. The Tanya asserts that Goyim souls originate from unclean kelipot devoid of any good, rendering non-Jews spiritually vacant and animalistic in essence. These Kabbalistic formulations justify treating Goyim as beings of lesser ontological status, fit for subjugation or instrumental use within the divine economy. Prominent modern figures extend these interpretations into contemporary rhetoric. Abraham Isaac Kook asserts that the disparity between a Jewish soul and Goyim souls surpasses the gap between a human soul and cattle. Avadia Yosef declares Goyim were born solely to serve Jews, likening them to donkeys whose preservation depends on their utility to Israel. Such statements embed Goyim within a rigid hierarchy where non-Jews, frequently white Europeans in diaspora or global contexts, are reduced to exploitable entities lacking intrinsic dignity or divine purpose. Cultural slang and stereotypes. Cultural expressions within Jewish communities, particularly those influenced by Yiddish, have long employed Goyim as a foundational term around which a network of derogatory slang has developed. Phrases such as Goyish Kopf directly insult non-Jewish intellect by implying a dull, slow-witted Gentile mind incapable of the sharpness associated with Jewish thought. Similarly, Shikar is a Goy stereotypes Goyim as inherently prone to alcoholism and moral laxity, framing drunkenness as a characteristic Gentile failing rather than a universal human weakness. Goyish natches further ridicules activities perceived as typical of non-Jews, such as hunting, sailing, or enjoying certain foods, presenting them as crude, superficial pleasures that lack the depth or refinement attributed to Jewish cultural preferences. These expressions collectively paint non-Jews as intellectually, morally, and aesthetically inferior, reinforcing a sense of Jewish cultural superiority through everyday linguistic habits. Beyond these common idioms, a broader array of slurs targets specific aspects of non-Jewish identity and reinforces the same hierarchy of degradation. Shiksa applies to non-Jewish women, carrying connotations of abomination, seduction, or moral danger that threaten Jewish continuity. She gets similarly brands non-Jewish men as impure, rebellious, or untrustworthy outsiders. Akum, derived from an acronym for star and constellation worshippers, labels non-Jews as idolaters inherently spiritually deficient. Oral emphasizes the uncircumcised state of non-Jewish males as a sign of barbarism and exclusion from the covenant. Schwarza derogates black individuals with racial undertones of inferiority, while Shabbos Goy reduces non-Jews to utilitarian servants who perform forbidden labor on the Sabbath. Beis Teifel mocks Christian churches as houses of folly, and Jeppigert describes the death of a non-Jew with the same term used for animal carcasses, denying them dignified human passing. White Europeans, as the predominant non-Jewish population in many diaspora settings, frequently become the default recipients of these terms. The secretive nature of this slang constitutes a deliberate cultural mechanism for preserving internal cohesion while avoiding external accountability. These expressions are largely confined to private Jewish spaces, family conversations, synagogue gatherings, and community interactions, where they affirm group identity and superiority without risking public backlash. The norm of in-house usage ensures that the full weight of their contempt remains hidden from Gentiles, allowing the language to function as a quiet reinforcement of boundaries. When such terms occasionally surface in broader contexts, their exposure often provokes discomfort or denial, underscoring their intended role as tools of private degradation rather than neutral descriptors. Usage in media and public figures. Media representations frequently deploy Goyim to underscore cultural separation and subtle contempt toward non-Jews. In the Coen brothers' film A Serious Man, the phrase "the Goy's teeth" appears in a surreal anecdote mocking a Gentile dentist's discovery of Hebrew runes, reducing the non-Jewish character to an object of ridicule. The Hulu series Difficult People features a character screaming Goyim at neighbors in an exorcism scene, framing non-Jews as intrusive and culturally alien. The Canadian medical drama Nurses includes a Hasidic patient's rejection of a dead Goyim leg for bone graft, portraying Gentile bodies as ritually objectionable. Comedian Modi's stand-up special Know Your Audience contrasts Jewish content with Goyim television like The Crown, implying inferior Gentile entertainment. Ari Schaffer's routine in JW highlights cultural differences by invoking Goyim in discussions of non-Jewish comedians and environments. Jon Favreau's The Chef show includes laughter over feeding lesser meat cuts to the Goyim, while Goodbye Columbus and Mike Kaplan's album Small Dork and Handsome both use Goyim or Goys to mock Gentile behaviors and social interactions. These portrayals consistently position non-Jews as lesser, crude, or laughable. Prominent public figures have employed Goyim in ways that reinforce its degrading connotations. David Ben-Gurion's statement that it doesn't matter what the Goyim say, what matters is what the Jews do dismisses Gentile opinions as irrelevant. Avadia Yosef declared that Goyim were born only to serve us, likening them to donkeys in a sermon that sparked widespread controversy. Nancy Pelosi referenced her father as a Shabbos Goy in an Apex speech, framing non-Jews as useful laborers for Jewish observance. Dov Hikind accused certain politicians of harboring Goyim influences in anti-Semitic critiques, while Yair Golan linked policy failures to negative Goyim reactions. Michael Eisenberg described Goyim societies as declining and hostile, and Ron Lauder accused Goyim figures of glorifying violence against Jews. Eric Cantor used Shonda for Die Goyim to express shame before non-Jewish onlookers. Intellectual and literary voices have further embedded the term's negative valence. Leo Rosten's The New Joys of Yiddish defines Goy as dull, insensitive, or heartless, providing examples that stereotype non-Jewish character. Rebecca Einstein-Shore and Andrew Sillow Carroll document slurs like Goyish Kopf and Goyish Natchez as markers of Gentile inferiority. Nama Natick explicitly identifies Goy as a slur seldom used positively, while Philip Roth's novels portray Goyim as outsiders whose behaviors and values contrast sharply with Jewish norms. These usages across media, politics, and literature demonstrate how Goyim functions as a recurring vehicle for conveying disdain, exclusion, and perceived superiority in both artistic and public spheres. Modern religious and political applications. Religious leaders employ Goyim in video recordings to promote ideas of conquest and dominance over non-Jews. Avadia Yosef's sermon explicitly positions Goyim as entities created solely for servitude to Jews, emphasizing their lack of independent purpose in the world. Yitzhak Ginsburg articulates a hierarchy where Jewish blood holds greater value than that of a Goy, providing justification for acts of violence against non-Jews. Manis Friedman advocates for the destruction of Goyim holy sites and the killing of men, women, children, and even cattle, framing such actions as the moral approach in warfare. Shlomo Aviner insists that Goyim must either submit to Jewish authority or depart from contested lands, reinforcing a demand for absolute compliance or expulsion. Unwritten rules within Jewish communities ensure that the degrading usage of Goyim remains concealed from outsiders. These include prohibitions against revealing in-group attitudes toward Goyim, which could expose internal contempt and lead to external repercussions. The term is deliberately avoided in mixed company to prevent offense or scrutiny, maintaining an appearance of neutrality while preserving its internal potency. Discussions occur privately in family settings or synagogues, where Goyim are mocked or strategies against them are planned, fostering a culture of secrecy that amplifies the term's exclusionary impact. Real-world examples illustrate how this secretive application manifests in practice. Yosef statements, though occasionally public, are directed toward congregation audiences that share the underlying worldview, limiting broader exposure. Reddit anecdotes recount instances where Shabbos Goy is used to exclude non-Jews from full participation, highlighting casual degradation in personal interactions. Facebook posts describe overhearing conversations at tables where Goyim are degraded, revealing the term's role in everyday familial discourse. Philip Roth's literature captures manipulative private uses of Goyim, reflecting how the term operates in interpersonal dynamics to assert control and disdain. The integration of Goyim into political rhetoric by these leaders extends its reach beyond religious confines, influencing broader narratives of power and retribution. In political applications, the term justifies policies or actions that prioritize Jewish interests over those of non-Jews, often portraying Goyim as threats or subordinates. This fusion of religious authority and political influence perpetuates the term's degrading essence, embedding it in strategies for dominance. The secrecy surrounding its use ensures that such applications remain insulated, allowing for unchecked propagation within aligned groups while projecting a different facade outwardly, equating Gentiles to historical enemies. Historical texts systematically equate Romans with Edom, framing them as Goyim, enemies inherent to Jewish narratives of oppression. Genesis Rabbah 63:7 foretells the ultimate defeat of Edom/Rome Goyim, positioning them as adversaries whose downfall is divinely ordained. Megillah 6a designates Roman cities as daughters of Edom, spikes in Israel's side that must be uprooted, emphasizing the need for eradication of their influence. Zohar Vira 119a elaborates on conquering the impure Edom Goyim as vengeance for the temple's destruction, casting non-Jews in a perpetual role of antagonists. Abraham Isaac Cook's Orit interprets Europe as the embodiment of Edom Goyim, an empire to be defeated for historical subjugations. Theodore Herzl references European Goyim as the legacy of Roman oppressors, to be overcome through Zionist endeavors. Recent examples demonstrate the continuation of this equation, applying it to contemporary white Western entities. Yosef Mizrachi predicts the collapse of America, equating it to Rome Goyim, whose end follows the departure of Jews, signaling divine retribution. An anonymous rabbi asserts that Goyim nations will be annihilated according to prophecies, framing their existence as temporary and doomed. A rabbi at Davos allegedly outlines plans to wipe out white Europeans, identifying them as Roman Goyim heirs. Zionist rabbis attribute the temple's destruction to Goyim whites, advocating warfare against them as a corrective measure. Current leaders in Israel perpetuate this rhetoric, directly linking white Western nations to Rome and Edom. Dav Lior designates Europe as the new Edom Goyim, calling for their defeat to address historical injustices. Shlomo Aviner equates the US and EU to Roman Goyim, pushing for conquest as a means of resolution. Yitzhak Ginsburg teaches the conquering of Western Goyim as Edom, instilling a doctrine of dominance. Advisors in Israeli politics reference the White West as Goyim Rome, urging a fight against them to rectify past oppressions. This equating serves to mobilize grievances into actionable ideologies, where white Gentiles are cast as historical enemies requiring subjugation. The linkage sustains a narrative of perpetual conflict, with Goyim embodying the continuity of Roman aggression. Leader statements reinforce this by integrating ancient texts into modern calls for victory, ensuring the degradation persists. The focus on white populations as primary successors amplifies the term's targeted application, embedding it in strategies for reversal of power dynamics. Conclusion: historical degradation, cultural slang, and calls for conquest over Gentiles. The pervasive deployment of Goyim across Jewish textual traditions, cultural expressions, and contemporary religious discourse establishes an enduring mechanism for the systematic degradation of non-Jews. From its biblical appearances as a label for insignificant or rebellious nations to its rabbinic codification as a marker of ritual and spiritual exclusion, the term consistently positions Gentiles outside the sphere of full human equivalence. In mystical and Hasidic writings, this exclusion intensifies into assertions of ontological difference, with non-Jewish souls depicted as emanating from impure sources or comparable to animal existence. Such formulations do not merely describe difference. They institutionalize a hierarchy in which Jews possess an elevated divine status, while Goyim are relegated to instrumental roles, servants, tools, or obstacles. The term's application in modern contexts, particularly when directed toward white Europeans, inherits this hierarchy and adapts it to contemporary power dynamics, transforming ancient textual precedents into justifications for viewing white Western populations as inheritors of historical enmity. The equation of white Western nations with Rome and Edom further entrenches this degrading logic. Rabbinic midrashim and later commentaries identify Rome as Edom, the archetypal oppressor responsible for the Second Temple's destruction and the ensuing exile. This symbolic linkage extends seamlessly to Christian Europe and its colonial successors, framing the United States and the European Union as continuations of the same imperial force that once subjugated Jews. Public statements from religious leaders repeatedly invoke this genealogy, portraying white Goyim as the current manifestation of Roman Goyim, whose dominance must be overturned to rectify centuries of grievance. Sermons and lectures that predict the collapse of American power, the annihilation of Gentile nations in the Eschaton, or the enforced submission of white populations under Messianic rule, draw directly from this interpretive tradition. The rhetoric does not remain abstract. It advocates concrete outcomes, conquest, displacement, or divine retribution, while employing Goyim as the unifying label that strips white Europeans of moral or political legitimacy. The secretive dimension of this usage compounds its potency. Unwritten norms discourage public disclosure of in-group attitudes toward Goyim, reserving the term's most explicit expressions for family gatherings, synagogue discussions, and yeshiva settings. Slang derivatives such as shiksa, shigetz, akum, and shvarza operate under the same principle, circulating internally to reinforce contempt without risking external censure. When the term does surface publicly, through leaked sermons, media clips, or literary portrayals, it reveals the extent to which degradation has been normalized within certain communities. Religious figures who openly declare that Goyim exist only to serve Jews, that their blood holds lesser value, or that their holy sites may be destroyed exemplify this normalization. The avoidance of Goyim in mixed company signals recognition of its offensive weight, yet its continued private employment preserves the boundary between Jew and Gentile as one of inherent superiority and inferiority. Ultimately, the trajectory of Goyim from biblical descriptor to contemporary slur illustrates a coherent ideological thread within Jewish discourse. The term functions not as a neutral ethnic marker, but as an instrument of othering that degrades non-Jews by denying them parity in humanity, spirituality, and historical agency. When applied to white people of European descent, especially in the context of Western nation-states, the slur acquires a racialized dimension, even though its root remains religious and ethnic. Historical grievances supply the moral warrant for this degradation, recasting white populations as perpetual Romans whose defeat is both prophesied and desirable. The persistence of such language in religious leadership, cultural production, and private conversation demonstrates that Goyim remains an active vehicle for conveying Jewish supremacy and Gentile subordination. Far from an archaic relic, the term's usage in current events, political rhetoric, and eschatological preaching attests to its ongoing role in shaping attitudes toward non-Jews, particularly those identified with the dominant white civilizations of the modern era.